All right, everybody. Strangely enough, my comment section has been filled with this request. So here you go. Just because you asked for it, this is how to set up a Rust server for free on your own PC. Hey everybody, welcome back to Rust Admin Academy, where I'm teaching you everything that you need to know about owning and operating a successful Rust server. Plus, I also have to be able to show you the basics of setting up a Rust server for yourself so that you can try all this stuff out at home on your own. So if you're brand new to the channel, consider subscribing so that you stay up to date on everything that we're working on. And of course, you'll get notified as soon as I upload a new video. All right, so this is a relatively quick and easy process. However, there are a couple of really important steps that you have to pay attention to, and I'm going to go over all of those details right now. So first things first, we have a little bit of work that we got to do first before we get started with anything else. The first thing that I want you to do is decide where this Rust server is going to live. It could be right on your desktop, it could be in your C drive, it could be on an external drive, it could be wherever you want it to be, but just make that decision right now because going forward, that information is going to matter. So we're just currently looking at my desktop right now. There's nothing else on there. There's just a single folder, and the title of that folder is Rust server. Now, we're already coming to our first important detail. So when you're naming this folder, and it doesn't matter where this folder resides, this rule runs true, you don't want to have any spaces in your folder name. You can't imagine how many times I've been helping somebody out figure out what's going on with their server to find out that the very first thing that they did was put a space in this name. So as you can see, I've got Rust server, no space in between. If I do this, and I know that's pretty small for you guys, you might not be able to see that very well, but Rust space server is not going to work in the same way. And of course, I can explain why that is, but just for simplicity reasons, let's just not put any spaces in any of our folder names. It'll make life a whole lot easier. All right, so I actually called it Rust Server 2026, again with no spaces in my folder name. So let's go in there, and in this folder, we want to create two more folders. The first one we're going to call steamcmd, and the second one I'm going to call server, but you can call it whatever you want, again, as long as there's no spaces in this folder name. You can call it my favorite Rust server. One long word. You can name this folder literally whatever you want, just make sure there's no spaces in the name. I know it sounds like I'm repeating this a lot, but trust me, if you only knew how many times I fixed somebody's problem simply by taking the space out of their folder name. Trust me. So steamcmd is a program that we're going to download here in a couple minutes. I'm going to show you. But what it is, think of it like a command prompt, because that's essentially what it is. It's a command prompt that talks directly to Steam. So we need to get information from Steam in order to install our Rust server, because that's where Rust comes from Steam. So I'm going to put a link in the video description down below to get to this page right here. This is the steamcmd. This is where we're going to download steamcmd from. We're going to click on this link right here, download steamcmd, and we're just going to let it download to our computer. It's going to download in a zip file. Once that download is complete, let's go into our steamcmd folder that we've now just created. And let's just drag and drop this steamcmd.zip into the steamcmd folder that we've created. And of course, we're going to extract this folder so that we can actually use what's inside it. I use 7-zip. You can use whatever works for you. I'm going to extract it to here so it doesn't go into another folder called steamcmd. And once we're done with that, we can delete the original zip folder. We don't need that anymore. And then we can run steamcmd. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to install all of the files that are required so that we can download anything from Steam down the road. For today's purposes, obviously we only need to download our Rust server, so that's all I'm going to be showing you today, but just let this run, let it do its thing, and when it's done, I'll come back. Once that's completed, of course, you can close down the window that we were just looking at a minute ago, and then you should be left with a folder that looks similar to this. From this point, we can just double click on steamcmd.exe, and it's going to reopen that same command prompt that we were looking at before. And this is where we're going to get started installing our actual Rust server. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to tell steamcmd to actually log in. Now, you can log in with your actual Steam credentials, but you don't have to. You can log in anonymously. And the command for that is just login space anonymous, and make sure you spell anonymous correctly. Now, the next thing that we have to do is we need to tell steamcmd where we actually want to install our Rust server. So let's go back a folder. Let's go into this actual folder that I've called server. You can call it whatever you want. And let's just click on this address bar at the top here. And let's just copy that to our clipboard. We're going to use it in just a minute. Now, the command to tell steamcmd where we're actually going to install the server is force_install _dir. And then we just paste it in the address that we copied a minute ago from the folder where we actually want our server to live. If you get a warning that says, please log into Steam before you proceed, well, we've already done that. There's a little bit of a discrepancy there about whether you should log in first or designate your folder first. And you can do it either way. This is just the way that I've historically done it, is log in first and then designate my folder. it'll still work. So you can basically ignore that yellow warning that you see on my screen right now where it says, please use force install dir before logon. No, you can't tell me what to do. Once we've designated the folder where we want our Rust server to go, now we can tell steamcmd to actually go ahead and install all those files. And the command for that is app_update with 258550 at the end. That 258550 is the Steam identifier for the actual application Rust. And it's going to start downloading the files and it's going to start installing your server, and we're going to wait till this is done and then I'm going to come back to you. Depending on your internet speed, this might take a couple of minutes. If you've got really fast internet, which I do not, this could only take 30 seconds or so. I don't have good internet, so we're going to wait this out. But don't worry, I'm going to edit this part out. While I'm waiting for that, let me just discuss a couple of things with you. So a lot of people use locally hosted Rust servers to do setups for servers that they plan on launching in the future. Another group of people that might use a localhost server is somebody that just wants to dip their toe in to see if this is something that they want to get into. And of course, there's a third group of people that might want to set up a private server just for themselves or just for their friends. If you just want to do a build server, basically, if you want to have a server that doesn't have to follow any rules, this is the way to do that. A lot of big server owners out there are setting up locally hosted servers all the time. They want to test something. They want to see how something's going to perform before they put it out in a real world application. There's a ton of different reasons why somebody might want to set up a locally hosted Rust server, which is really indicated by the number of people that come back to me every year and say they want an updated video, which is why we're here today doing this one. And once that's complete, we've now downloaded and installed everything that is required to run our Rust server. However, we have one more step that we have to do in order to actually get our server online. And that is we have to create the batch file that we're actually going to run that is going to boot up our server. Now think of a batch file as like an executable file for Windows that's actually going to boot up our server. So let's just go in and create a text document. I don't really care what method you use to do this, but let's just create a new text document. And here we can change the name of it to whatever we want it to be. In my case, I'm going to do server startup, no space, .bat. That's going to change this from a text file into a batch file. You're going to get a warning that says that it might cause instability, whatever, if you change the extension of a file. But this is what we want to do. So now we've got a file that looks like this. It doesn't look like the text file that we think that it might look like. It is now a batch file. So let's open this up and have a look at what we're going to put inside this batch file that's going to run our server. So let's click on edit with Notepad++. If you don't have Notepad++, I highly recommend you get it. It's going to make your life a whole lot easier than just using the default Notepad editor that comes with Windows. And I'll put a link to it in the video description down below for you, so it's super easy to get to it. So obviously this file is going to have nothing in it. So this is just a blank slate. So where do we get the information that we're going to put in here? Well, of course, I'm going to direct you to the video description down below. You can just copy pasta that directly from there into your newly created batch file, and I'll show you what needs to be changed in order for it to work for you. All right, so this is how I want everyone to start out. However, this is not how I want you to end up. So we're going to go through and start making some changes here. The first thing that we need to designate is where our batch file can find steamcmd.exe. So if we go back to the folder that we created at the very beginning, you can see that we've got steamcmd in its own folder. Let's go in there and you can see that we've got steamcmd.exe in here. So we need to copy this address right here, go back to our batch file, and let's replace this section right here where it says the wrong information. So now we've got the actual address of the folder that we created plus steamcmd.exe. And you should be noticing something familiar happening right after that. So we're going to tell steamcmd to log in anonymously, and then we're going to do force install dir and then our Rust server location. This Rust server location is not the right location though. So let's go get that right now too. Let's go back to our folder. Let's go back into our server folder and let's just grab this address right here, Control C to copy that to our clipboard. And then we can just come back over here and pasta that in right there, replacing the wrong information that comes with our default batch file. And then after that, steamcmd is then going to do app update 258550. Why is this so important when we've already done it? If you put this in your batch file, this is going to make it so that steamcmd, every time you launch your batch file, is going to check with Steam and make sure that there isn't an update. And if there is, it's going to automatically go ahead and install that update, which is going to work just fine for most people if you're not using modding platforms such as Oxide. If you want to be using plugins and admin tools and all of these other things, basically you're not going to be a vanilla server. There are some things that you're going to want to change here, but I'm going to get to that at the end of this video. Now, as far as the rest of this batch file goes, you're going to notice that everything else is all on one line, and that's not very readable. This will work, it will. but it's not very readable to the human eye. So what I like to do is actually break this up a little bit, but there's a little bit of trickery that you have to do in order to ensure that this is going to continue working after we've broken it up. So we want to break this up so that it's a little bit easier to read. And I mean, you would think that you would just be able to go in and like hit enter, send a line down to the next line, and that should work, right? No, that's not how this works. When we do drop down a line, there's something that we have to do at each line in order for it to continue working. So you want to have a space between the last command that we're leaving on that line, and then we want to add what's called a caret, which is Shift-6 on most keyboards. So basically what we're doing here is we're telling the program to complete that line and then go down to the next line. Whereas just hitting enter, it not only won't go to the next line, it won't go to any of the other lines. The app will just stop right at that location. So I'm going to go through it, make a couple of changes, and then I'm going to come back and explain to you what I've done here. All right, so I've zoomed this in so that you can get a better look at what I've done here. So what I've done is I've put each individual thing on its own line with a space after each individual CVAR with a caret at the end of each line. Now, something that I want to point out here is really important is you can't have any spaces after the caret. So if you can see that, yeah, you should be able to. So if you have a space after the caret, that will also cause the batch file to stop right there. Wherever it finds the space, that's where it's going to stop. So everything after that is going to get ignored by this batch file. So if you boot up your Rust server and you're like, my server isn't called what I think it's supposed to be called. It's not what I've defined in my batch file. It's called my Rust server something, something, something. I forget what the default Rust server name is, but it's not what you defined in here. It's probably because you've got a ghost space somewhere in your batch file, probably after one of these carets. So just go through and make sure that you don't have any ghost spaces at the end of any of these lines. You should be good to go. Now you'll see all this port information here. So if you're just having a private server just for yourself or people on your local network, your ports aren't going to matter a whole bunch. It will default to 28015 because that's the default Rust port. But if you're not looking for any outside access, you don't want people to be able to join your server from outside of your network, you don't really have to worry about this. But if you do want that, then of course this stuff is going to matter because you're going to need to be able to write port forwarding rules later in your router and modem and stuff like that in order to allow access to these ports. Server level, I just have procedural level in there. If you were doing like a barren map, you would change that right there. And then server seed and server world size. This is pretty easy stuff, but I'll show you where I get my map seeds from. So I use rustmaps.com. It allows you to select which map you want to use for your Rust server. For a server that I'm actually going to play on, I like using the size 4500 because that's now the default Rust size. But for today's example, I'm just using a really small 1500 map, I think it is. But when you go to rustmaps.com and you decide that you want to run this map, all of the information that you need is all up in the address of the map. So if we were doing a size 4500 map, this would be the map size right here. And then this is the map seed right here after that. So we could take that map seed number over to our batch file, put that information in here, and that's the map that this batch file is now going to load. Max players, server host name. So the server host name is how the server is going to appear, provided that you've done your port forwarding rules correctly, is how your server is going to appear in the Rust server directory when you've loaded up Rust. Bear in mind here, in a lot of cases, not all cases, but in a lot of cases, no matter what you do, even if your port forwarding rules are done correctly, you still may not see your server listed in the Rust server directory. Sometimes you do, most of the times you don't. But if your friend that isn't on your network can search for your server and find it, then you're in good shape. Just because you don't see it on your local network doesn't mean anything. Of course, we can add a server description. If we have a website for a server, you could put in the server URL right here. If you have a custom built server header image, you would put the address to where you're hosting that image right here. Now the server identity, this is another important detail. The server identity is how the server is going to appear on your local network. So in the folder that we created at the very beginning, this is how it's going to appear once we've booted up the server. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a minute. But the reason why this is so important is because you might want to be running multiple different servers. That server identity is going to tell you which server you're working in. The Archon password is also very important if you're going to be using an external Archon system, or if you're using something like Battlemetrics where they're going to need to be able to log into the Archon of your server. That Archon password, very important. It's also very important that you keep that very secure. So this password right here is obviously not a very good one. I would suggest using a password generator so that somebody can't hijack your server. If you are using an external Archon, you want to make sure that you're defining archon.web to 1 or true in order for that to function correctly. Once we're done with everything and we're comfortable with how everything is looking right now, let's save this. And because we've already called it a batch file, we don't have to do anything specific here. But if you weren't able to do it at that point, you would want to click on Save As, change this drop down to all file types, and then you can change it to a batch file right here. We did it at the beginning. You might choose to do it right now. Either way works. It all functions the same way. So now that we're done with the batch file, let's run our batch file for the very first time. We just double click on that file right there. It's going to bring up a Steam window like you're familiar with seeing, and then it's going to go through that entire process again of checking steamcmd for an update, running that update if needed. You can see that it's using the actual parameters that I've now used in the batch file, and it's going to boot us up a server following those parameters. So we'll just give that a couple minutes to finish up, and you might get this warning right here. Just make sure you allow access. What that is just allowing access through your Windows firewall, which should not be confused for actually writing port forwarding rules, which is going to allow other players to join your server from outside your network. That's not the same thing. I've done a really good video, a really comprehensive video on how to do all of your port forwarding stuff. Because there's so many different parameters, obviously I can't teach everybody everything about all of the different systems out there. So I've just kind of given a broad strokes overview, but with all of the important information. I'll put a link to it in the top right hand corner right now. You can check that out. And once you get to this point right here where it says down at the bottom the name of your server and a bunch of other information down there, your server is up and running. So you may get this red warning right here. What this says is Rust plus companion server connectivity test failed. What that means is the port that I've designated in the batch file doesn't have a port forwarding rule assigned to it, so I don't have outside access on that port. And as you know, the Rust Plus app obviously requires access so that you can connect to your server from your mobile network. I won't be doing that on this video, but if you follow the procedures that I've put forth in the video that I just put a link to in the top right hand corner a couple minutes ago, it will explain all of the different rules that you have to set up for all of your different ports. All right, so great. Now we've got our server up and running. Now what? Now what do we do? Well, let's go into Rust. Let's hit the F1 to open up our F1 console, and let's connect to our server. Now, like I said before, you probably won't be able to search out your server even if you have done your port forwarding rules correctly. So for ease, I would just suggest using your F1 menu and connecting directly. Now that's probably pretty small for you to read, but what that says there is client.connect localhost with a colon, and then the port number for our server, which in our case is 28015. You don't have to do the client dot at the beginning. You can just do connect. Both work. It functions the same way. So I'm going to hit F1 to close my F1 menu, and we'll just watch as everything happens. So you can see in the background there, I'm actually loading into the server, which is going to take a couple of minutes. And as you can see there, it showed me in console loading into the server, and here we go. Now I'm running around in my Rust server. Now, of course, I understand. I know you want to be able to fly around. I know you want to be able to spawn items in, but guess what? You can't do any of that yet. So what we have to do in order to do all of those things is we need to assign our Steam64 ID as the owner of this server. Well, you're like, yeah, I'm the owner of this server. Yeah, we need to tell the server that this Steam64 ID is the actual owner of this server. So I'm just going to copy that right now. I'm going to go in here. I'm going to type owner ID. I'm going to pasta that in there. I'm going to put my name in here inside of quotations. And you can also put in a reason if that helps you down the road. If you're going to have a bunch of people on here, you might want to have a reason for each one of them. I'm just going to call myself developer. Owner added the bull with that Steam64 ID, and we need to write that to the configuration file. So we just do write CFG, and that will save that to the configuration file. So the next time we load in, it already knows that we're the owner of this server, and it allows us all of those privileges. So, okay, great. We're now the owner, right? No. Let's open up our F1 console and try to spawn in items. Still can't do it, right? That's because we need to disconnect and reconnect to the server again. So I'm going to go into my F1 console and I'm going to type in disconnect, and then I'm going to reconnect again to that same server. And if you didn't know that, because I didn't actually shut down Rust, I can just recall the command that I used previously by hitting up arrow twice on my keyboard. So if I hit it once, it would recall the disconnect command. If I hit it twice, it's going to go back to the actual connection command that we used previously. All right, so now that we're an owner, we've disconnected and reconnected, we should be able to fly around and spawn in items. So let's go into F1 console. Let's type noclip and let's see if we can fly around. And sure enough, here we are flying around. Let's see if we can spawn in items. Let's go into the items menu, and sure, I'll take an AK and I'll take this blowpipe and blah, 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 blah. You can see that I now have all of these things that I just spawned in directly from the menu. Don't do this because it's a terrible, terrible idea, but there are certain applications where you're gonna need to be able to spawn in items. But let me just warn you, as soon as a single player sees an admin spawning in items, that server is completely wrote off. So don't get caught doing that when other players can see you doing it. Trust me. So now what I like to do is I like to put all of the different commands. I use a lot of different commands, as I'm sure you can imagine, but the basic ones I put on hotkeys. So I can just, instead of having to go to the F1 menu and typing in noclip, I can just hit L on my keyboard and it will put me into noclip mode. And to do that, you just go into your F1 console and you type in bind, and in my case, I use the letter L and then noclip. So we're binding L to noclip. Another helpful tool that's built into Rust that you are going to make use out of if players are going to be joining your server is the debug camera. So I like to use bind P debug camera. So whenever I'm running around and I see something going on that I want to spy on somebody while they're doing it, I can just hit P on my keyboard. You can see that it dumps my camera away from my player character, and I can go around and actually explore what this other player is doing or what somebody is doing without my player character attached to it, so they don't even know that I'm there. And then you can just hit P again or debug camera in F1 console to go back to your player character. You know you don't have to die and respawn. Think of noclip, debug camera, even God mode is kind of a toggle. It's on or it's off, and you can just flip it back and forth. Speaking of God mode, another great tool so that you don't take any damage while you're in your server is God mode. So what I do is I bind God mode on and off on two different keys. So I do bind 9 God 1, which is turning it on and assigning that to my number 9 key on my keyboard. And then I do bind 0 God.0 to turn that off. Just to make life easy, I'm going to put all of that information in the video description down below as well. Plus then if you use the exact same commands, you'll be set up exactly the same way I am. All right, so if that's what you came here for, if that's what you wanted to learn from this video, you're done. You don't have to carry on any further. However, if you now want to add Oxide to your Rust server, we're going to cover that next. If you don't know if you want to add Oxide to your server, if you ever want to use any kind of plugin on your server, any kind of admin tool, anything like that, you're going to need to have a modding platform, and I'm going to be showing you Oxide, but of course there is also Carbon, but Carbon is a completely different beast, so nothing that I'm teaching on today's video is going to be translatable into Carbon, so let's get started. All right, so for right now, we can just close this server. If you really want to, you could save your server before you close it, but in my case, I don't really care. And we're going to go to umod.org. We're going to click on games on the top row. And obviously we want to download Oxide for Rust. And we want to just grab the latest version, which is always at the top of this page right here. We can click on download. And this of course is going to download to our local PC. And once we've got that in our downloads folder, we're just going to drag and drop it over into our server folder. We're not done yet. We have to extract this because this right now is useless. So we're going to right click and we're going to click on 7-zip again because that's what I use. But we need to tell it where we want to extract these files to. We want this zipped file to be extracted into our Rust dedicated _data folder. So by selecting where we're going to unzip this folder, we can just click on OK, and it's going to unzip all of that information into the correct folder. And then we can delete the zip folder that we started out with, and then we can reboot our server, and you're going to see some differences here. But before we boot our server to see Oxide installed, we need to do something to our batch file to make this work properly. So if you remember, we have this line at the very top of our batch file that is basically going to check with Steam and see if there's an update every time this server starts. But what this is going to do is it's going to notice that Oxide has been installed and revert it back to a vanilla server. So we don't want that to happen anymore. So what we're going to actually do is remove this line completely from our batch file, and then we're going to actually create a new batch file with just that line on it. I'll explain as I'm doing it. So let's just open up a new text document and let's pasta that line back in there just as it was when we took it out of the previous one. And we're going to save this file as, click on save as, and let's call this an updater file. So this is now our updater batch file. So I'm going to call it updater.bat. So now we've got our server startup.bat and our updater.bat. Now the reason why I separated that out is because we don't want the server to revert back to vanilla every time we start it. But we do still need to be able to update our server when we need to. Namely, on the first Thursday of every month when Facepunch puts out their forced patch update. We don't have a choice. We have to update the server when they do that. So now I've removed that line, so I'm not risking updating my server or reverting it back to vanilla. I can now run my server again. So let's just double click on that batch file. And as your server is booting up, it's going to look different from the first time you booted it. And that's okay, because it's now recognizing that Oxide is installed. So it's going to appear different. Don't panic. Once the server is done booting up, we can do an o.version in console just to check and make sure that Oxide is actually installed and it is the most up-to-date version. You get a response that looks like this, you're good to go. Plus, you'll also notice that in your folder, you now have this folder called Oxide, which has all of these lovely folders inside of it. So you would drag and drop your plugins into your plugins folder. And then as the plugin compiles, it will probably create a configuration file, which you'll find in here, maybe a data file that you'll find in here, definitely a lang file that you're going to find in here. This is where you're going to do a majority of your modding when it comes to your Rust server. I just grabbed a plugin real quick just so that I can show you what it looks like when you're actually installing a plugin. So I just grabbed the Vanish plugin. So I'm just going to drag and drop that into my plugins folder, and you'll see that the compiler has booted up, and then it went ahead and did everything that it needed to do for the Vanish plugin to work correctly. So we should be able to go into the configuration folder and see a Vanish configuration file in there where we can edit how the Vanish plugin is actually going to function on our server. And this is going to be full. You're going to have a ton of plugins in here, a ton of configuration files. Just go slowly and pay attention to what you're doing. You can't just drag and drop a plugin and expect it to do exactly what you want it to do. You're probably going to have to configure something, so just keep that in mind. If we did go into the Vanish configuration file and make changes, so we want it to act a little bit differently than it does by default, you go into the config, you make your changes, you save those changes, you go back to your console, and then you do an o.reload, and then whatever the plugin name is, in this case, this was Vanish. So we would do o.reload Vanish. It would grab the new configuration that we just changed and reload the plugin like that. Another really important thing that I want to talk to you about is the data folder, because it is really important. Now, when you're installing plugins, some of the plugins are going to generate a data file that you're not going to want to carry over from one wipe to the next. So when you take your server offline to update it or wipe it or whatever it is that you're doing, you have to decide if you need to go in and delete some of those data files. A good example of that would be the kits plugin. The kits plugin actually has two data files. One of them holds the actual kit information that we need. You don't want to delete that one, but you do want to delete the player information for the kits plugin. I know I'm getting into the weeds a little bit here, but I'm just trying to give you some examples so that you're aware when you're installing a plugin, do I need to delete the data file when I'm wiping or updating my server? And depending on the type of server that you're going to run, you may end up with a lot of those that need to be deleted whenever you're wiping your server. So just be aware. That's all I'm saying. So now you saw me break out the update line from our batch file and put it into its own batch file. So why that's important, like I said before, is because you don't want to update your server every time you reboot your server, because when you do that, it reverts it back to a vanilla server. That doesn't mean that it's going to delete all of the work that you've done on your plugins. Your plugins are safe, your configuration files are still safe. It's just that the server no longer has Oxide on it, so it's not going to actually use any of that Oxide information. So if it were a wipe day or an update day or whatever, we would close our server down. We would run this updater.bat to get the new version from Steam. We would have to reinstall Oxide again, which after you've done it a couple of times, it goes pretty quick, like 5 seconds and you're done. And then we would reboot our server again. So now our server is updated. We checked with Steam to get the latest update. We've now, of course, we've installed the latest version of Oxide, because whenever Facepunch updates Rust, Oxide has to be updated as well. And the team over at umod.org usually have the Oxide update out before the actual Rust update. How they do that is magic. I don't understand it, but they do normally. So when we were talking earlier about our batch file and this server identity right here, I said that this was an important line that I wanted you to remember it because we were going to come back to it later. Guess what? We're coming back to it. So here we go. So if we go into the server folder, you're going to see there it says 2024 test server, because I didn't change it on my batch file. But our batch file created a folder just for this server right here. And that's what this information is in here. So we've got player data, player deaths. We've got our blueprint files in here. We've got our map saves in here. This is another folder that you might want to look at during an update or a wipe day to decide if you want to get rid of some of this information, because over a wipe, you don't have to keep your map saves unless you're running the same map. I guess you could, but you don't have to. And if you were going to be resetting the player's blueprints, you would of course go in and delete the blueprints file from this folder right here. When I'm going through a wipe cycle, I delete everything except for relationships and companion ID information. So when I'm going through a wipe cycle, I'm left with literally 4 files in here. So I delete all my map saves, all my player states, everything goes. The only thing that stays is the relationship. So the teams that have been built on your server, that will stay persistent if you keep these files here. And then of course the companion ID information so that people don't have to reconnect their phone to your server. Plus what this does by having server identities assigned to each one of your servers, you can run multiple servers out of this same location. You don't have to do the process that we've done today for each individual server. You've already done all the hard work. All you got to do is create a new batch file for your new server. Make sure you give it a new server identity so that it gets its own folder right here. And then you can basically run as many servers as you want. So I think I've kept you here for plenty long enough. This is just a brief introduction to what it's like setting up and hosting a server on your local network. There are a ton of more details that you're going to need to know. Port forwarding, which plugins to use, which plugins you can use on a vanilla server without violating any terms of services. There's just an absolute plethora of information. Now my channel has a ton of that already prepared for you. Chances are pretty good that if you run into something, you're gonna find the answer to it on this channel. If you still can't find the answers that you're looking for, head on over to srtbull.com or rustadminacademy.com. And down at the bottom of the page, you're gonna see a link to 2 different Discords. The one on the left is my free Discord where most people go, and you can ask all the questions in the world you want in there. Of course, if you want a more personalized access to me and my other members, then click on the Discord on the right hand side and become a member. It allows me to get a little bit more personal and definitely a little bit more hands-on with your problems so that I can help you get to the solution that you're looking for. I know that I'm going to have more questions that I need to answer, and I will continue to do that in my upcoming videos as well as in my Discord and also in my comment section down below. So if you have questions, you can post them down there. I do my very best to answer every single one of them. But if not, hit me up in Discord and I'll definitely try to help you out. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoy setting up a Rust server in 2026. And I hope I've answered enough questions in this video so that most of you are going to be successful with that. Don't forget to check out my port forwarding video. It is incredibly important that you understand how all of that works. Again, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next week.